Welcome to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Fire University, hosted by Marcus Lashley.
Hey everybody, this is Marcus Lashley from UF Deer Lab. I just wanted to take a moment to tell you how much we've enjoyed bringing you all this content, all the feedback, the ideas for new episodes, the engagement on social media, tagging us in posts where you're using the practices you've learned about. That has all been just absolutely amazing and we really appreciate it. However, our administration is still not convinced that we're having an impact. So if you've been enjoying the content and it's useful to you, please take a moment to fill out our survey. It takes less than a minute of your time, but it'll really help us to convince them that we need to continue to do this. You can find the link in the show notes of this episode or on social media at UF Deer Lab or at Dr. Disturbance. Who knows? If we really blow up that survey, we might convince them that we don't need to get rid of this. We need to expand it to more topic areas. But we need your feedback to make that happen. We have another great show for you today. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed as much as we did bringing it to you.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University Podcast Network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals, not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today we're going to talk about another timely topic. I know a lot of our listeners are really interested in whitetail deer. So we are going to talk with one of the foremost experts on that topic and how we might use fire to manage for whitetail deer, particularly as it relates to fawning and lactation and antler growth, since we're kind of coming up on the time when that's important for a lot of people. So I have Bronson Strickland here today with me. Appreciate you coming on the show, Bronson.
Happy to be here anytime.
Yeah. Well, this is something that comes up all the time for me. I'm sure maybe not in quite the same context for you, but I know that you get tons of questions about providing nutrition and cover and just habitat in general for deer. And I think especially in the South, one of the really important tools to do that or to influence it is fire. So I thought it'd be a good time for us to have some of those discussions.
Yeah. And, it's really, I think, neglected a lot. We, especially on Deer University, it's might be thought of as Antler University because antlers are a big part of that. But we often don't put enough emphasis on where it all begins.
Yeah.
And it starts with mom, and it starts with that fawn and the good habitat that you provide for both nutrition and survival. And fire plays a huge role, probably one of the biggest roles in that process.
Well, at least, historically, before we had all these other things that we were doing on the landscape, I mean, you just have to imagine, back in the 1700s or whatever, when there weren't food plots and there wasn't, the level of agriculture and supplemental feeding and all that stuff that we do, or, a lot of people do to manage deer nutrition. They were living off the land, living off the fire.
Absolutely. And depending on where you're at, maybe a lot lower density too. We didn't have agriculture like we do now. There wasn't corn and soybean everywhere. It was what native, naturally occurring plants were available and their stage of growth in terms of were they in reach of deer and what their nutrient quality was. So yeah, deer co-evolved with the plant community.
Yeah. Well, I know that we've talked about this quite a bit, and on your show on Deer University, we we have, even, with me, and I've heard you talk about it, and I certainly have talked about it plenty in other avenues as well. But I guess all that to say, I get a few questions really commonly, and I think that I'd like to hear, I guess, what you have to say about those questions, because they seem to come up enough that people wonder about it. So could you just give us a description, I guess? We can talk about, southern pine forest, or whatever you want to, but what are we looking for from a fawning standpoint? Like, if you got this, this mother that's just about to give birth, what do we want it to look like on the landscape where she's going to do that, and why?
I just thought of something real quick. I don't know if I have
the subject.
No, I'm not changing. I'm going to use another species that maybe, I don't know, maybe it'll help, maybe it won't. But I know, you and I both, Marcus, you're talking about fire and turkey and deer, and I'm talking about deer, but we also work with people like waterfowl ecologists. And I remember one of our experts, he's retired now from Mississippi State, named Rick Kaminsky. And probably one of the questions he would get all the time, like some of the questions we get all the time with the stuff we're going to talk about, is why did a duck land over there and not over there? And I don't know if this was his term or if this was a common term in the avian or waterfowl community, but he said it's like an image that induces a settling response. A settling response of, it's almost like a little checklist of this, and that place looks good. Let's settle down right there. And I kind of think of that with does and where they're going to give birth and put their fawns. We don't know this, of course, Marcus. I wish we could ask does, what are you looking for? All we can do is look at the commonalities.
You mean to tell me, after all this time you've been studying deer and all the crazy things that I've seen you do trying to understand deer, that you still don't understand what they're thinking?
We still don't have a survey that we can ask them. I wish we did, but I tend to think of it as they're looking for a place, and I generally say they need cover, some security waist high. It can certainly be greater, but you really have to think about, you want that fawn to be able to stand up, or you want the doe to be able to lay down and keep her head up, just where there is security around that. And you and I actually did a little video on this years ago, and we just called it the basketball technique. And we related it to, if you could just throw a basketball over your shoulder and you can turn right around and see it, that's probably not good fawning cover. That's a good point. We actually have another clip from that same place. We need to get that together. I hate to bring this up in such a public forum, but you've kind of been delinquent on giving us some time to do that.
Are you saying that I dropped the ball?
I'm saying you dropped the basketball. It's in your inbox, buddy.
Well, I can't find it because the fawning cover is so excellent. No, that's a good point. We should get that together and try to get that up online so folks can go see that when they listen to this. Okay. So it sounded like to me, when you're talking about the image and the whole way that you explained that, it seemed like to me it was all visual obstruction. Is that what you're talking about? Like, were you just trying to hide the fawn from stuff that wants to eat it?
Yeah, well, I think, in terms of the birthing site or parturition site, of course, if you're in a deer pen, like in our research facility, they'll just lay down and have it, but, at least you would think in the wild, they're probably going to go somewhere that's going to have some screening cover for them. They're very vulnerable, obviously, during this process. And then after the fawn is born, it's going to be immobile for several weeks. And so, they've invested all of this energy into growing this 1 unit or 2 unit package of 1 or 2 fawns. yeah, they want to be strategic about where they put it to, have the highest likelihood of survival. And if
Sure.
they have a choice, it is generally not going to be in the wide open.
Well, do you think, so I'm just thinking about, okay, we've got this understory that is providing a lot of concealment. And then do you think that we might see just as much bedding or fawning or whatever out in the field that provides that unit, or are we going to see that more in a forest that has a really well developed, I guess, it has a partial canopy and you're getting a lot of sunlight in, and maybe a frequent, disturbance fire, and you have that well developed understory? Are we going to see very similar selection of those two?
I do not have a good answer for you based on any research we've done or a study that specifically addressed it like you did. Here's my educated guess. It's really going to be an issue of what is available or not. Does a doe have a choice or not?
Yeah.
And you could envision, just like you described, Marcus, where you could have an opening or a prairie like area adjacent to a managed or open canopied forest where they may have a similar amount of herbaceous, biomass, knee-high, waist-high, et cetera. I would envision selection being pretty similar for that. Maybe, but also another issue might be thermoregulatory issues as well.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question to you, because, I don't know exactly what's going to happen on June 22nd, let's say, in North Florida, but I can tell you one thing, it's going to be hot.
It's going to be hot.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, yeah, I was wondering, that was what I was going to ask you, and you're getting to that point, I think. How much of that is it, how much of it is that visual obstruction versus just trying to stay cool enough, so that little packet of energy, as you called it, something along those lines, doesn't overheat.
Yeah. I don't, gosh, and I very well may be wrong. I don't know if anybody has really quantified that well.
Seems like something that's needed.
Yeah.
We're kind of getting into that thermal landscape stuff with a bunch of species, and it's been remarkably important.
Yeah.
Like some of the small game bird stuff, like the quail and prairie chicken stuff that has come out recently about that, has shown the thermal landscape is pretty critical.
Yeah.
So it's really curious.
And it may, it probably varies, just like you said, in June in North Florida, you can guarantee it's going to be hot, but you might be in another part of the country and the thermoregulatory issue may be different, because fawning or parturition may be at a different time. And those mornings could be really chilly.
Yeah. The Upper Peninsula in Michigan, for instance, it might be real cold.
Right.
They need to be buffered from that. I guess the structure could be doing either one, as long as it's buffering it from ambient.
And kind of the way I think about it, Marcus, is to me, the greatest leverage you have in terms of fawning cover and in terms of nutrition is you just have to, for a good proportion of the landscape you manage, and I hope it's greater than 50%, but some places obviously it can't be, is you're just managing for early succession plant communities. And the way I rationalize it is everything is most likely going to take care of itself. I don't know if you can really start micromanaging beyond that.
Yeah. Well, it also, when I think about the bird world, particularly, I think a lot about little turkeys, poults, and it's the same kind of deal, especially when they're really young, that early successional community structure, whether it's under a broken canopy or out in the open, is really important. And that was kind of one of the reasons I thought about the thermal stuff, because that's been important. And I guess just to ask you directly, so if we had a field, let's say a switchgrass, I think that's pretty commonly planted in some places for cover, that may not necessarily provide what you're talking about, even though it's an early successional plant community. because it's all grass and the structure of that, it would screen, it'd be screening cover really well. It hides the fawn, but it may not be the most thermal environment and certainly not the most nutritious environment either. Do you think that's a good way to look at it?
Yeah, I think it's very reasonable. I absolutely do. And yes, it's what makes a lot of the studies we do, Marcus, so difficult is that you always have to say, vegetation type for bedding or for movement or whatever. It always has to be put in the perspective of what is available and does the deer have a choice or not?
Yeah.
You and I have talked hundreds of conversations probably on the deer like this plant more, this plant more. Well, dang, it depends on what choice did it have. We joke about it with food plot stuff. Yeah. Deer are going to eat ryegrass in Mississippi if all they got to eat is ryegrass in Mississippi, but they don't want to necessarily eat it. I think it's kind of the same thing. So if you were to, if you were an artist and you had the switchgrass field, just like you're saying, but then you had a diverse community with grasses and forbs, and the doe had a choice, I would wager she's going to choose the diverse area that's going to have similar structure, but now there's also food available to her.
Yeah. And there has been research on that, and the thermal buffer is much greater in the higher diversity thing with the forbs in particular. Forbs and some of the young shrubs that might invade. There's a lot more thermal heterogeneity that they can utilize in that. So it's really interesting. Along those same lines, so we're talking, you're talking about the structure, I guess, of the vegetation and composition to some degree, but what about the timing of fawning itself? What is governing when the fawns are being born? Like, is it shifting much in a given location? I know that it shifts a lot across so just trying to give you some fodder to think about. Kind of why I'm asking you.
Well, I typically get the question from the other end of the continuum. The question I get most often, and the answer is the same, but it usually starts with, why is the rut so variable, for example, in the South? Why is it pretty consistent, November, mid-November, late, whatever, Midwest and up north, and gosh, it's all over the place in the South. And it has nothing to do, there's no advantage for when the breeding event happens. The breeding event is time for when the fawn hits the ground to maximize its survival. And it's
okay. So you're saying that they may breed in November here and October there and February over here, and that is more related to what's happening when the fawn is born than actually what's occurring during breeding.
When that buck is in hard antler, sheds that velvet, he's got months and months where he is a viable breeder. He'll breed every opportunity he can that is availed to him. But what governs it is the timing of estrus. And why the timing of estrus is because of when it is optimal to have that fawn. You might say, well, how would a doe know the timing? Well, we know that conception is a heritable trait. So they pass that down. Doe mothers will pass it down to their female offspring. And so when you have successful breeding event after successful breeding event and offspring live, they inherit the timing for when they were conceived and then subsequently born. That's the evolutionary feedback process to shape up or frame up when that time is. So the next question may be, why is there so much variation, especially, Mason-Dixon line South? That's because we don't, in the South, I'm saying we don't have the environmental bottlenecks as much as there is up north. We have a longer growing season. We don't have as harsh of a winter. So you're in Michigan, Canada, wherever, it gets really cold, really, really cold. Growing season is a lot shorter. you really have only, a small amount of time when you need to drop that fawn. You can't drop it a month early. It's too cold. You drop it too late, there's not enough time within the growing season to get to a critical mass to live through the following winter as a fawn. That really doesn't occur in the South. Also, what it kind of distorts that relationship a little bit in the South is all of the restocking that took place here, getting back to the heritable conception date.
Moving deer everywhere.
We've got deer. I mean, I'm not just saying Mississippi, I'm going to say the South, but let's just even say Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, we've got deer from Texas. We had deer from Mexico. We had deer from North Carolina. We had deer from Wisconsin. We had deer from Ohio, on and on and on. And so you just kind of end up with this melting pot of what those conception dates are. And there's just really isn't a strong environmental force to push it to where it's hard and fast. The rut's got to be the third week of November. And where you're at, Marcus, is a great example. Where I'm at in Mississippi, we've got places where the rut can begin as early as late November in Mississippi. We got places where deer season is over, and 2 weeks after that, in mid-February or later, the rut's going on. And but the bottom line is, over a deep time, back to the 1700s and before, but all those at a population scale was based on when the rut occurs and subsequently birthing events or parturition occurs, when you see the greatest survival for the fawn.
So you said something about the weather, which makes a lot of sense. So what else is, I guess, all of the things that we've been talking about are governing that success?
One of the big ones, that probably doesn't resonate if you're in maybe Tennessee or Georgia or anything like that. One thing that's pretty big in Mississippi is flooding. And so that's a classic environmental event here. And even when I was doing some research on this, examples like in parts of Florida as well.
Florida,
Yeah. So you don't want to drop a fawn in a mud puddle. That's just not optimal time for them.
Or a gigantic wetland.
Right.
That's all getting flooded. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I also have seen some research from other ungulates that they kind of couch it in a little different way, but it's all of these things are playing together, but they couched it as the abundance of food availability, I guess, like when that peak is, which of course would be, just like you're saying, it was sort of be bound within those same conditions as well.
Right. So, the up north would be a really good example from both surviving, a harsh winter, but also there within, June, for example, the growing season is wide open there. And that's the best time to have a fawn.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Something else that made me think about, and it's sort of going back to it's related to both, but I remember doing a little bit of research on just trying to understand lactation in mammals and different kinds of herbivores, and I stumbled across some of the literature from the agricultural literature base on cows, and they were talking about milk production in the female. And of course, we're talking about, in a dairy operation, and a lot of these things, they have all the cows inside of a building, and they'll have these giant fans blowing on them. And, I've always just found that pretty interesting thinking about that. And I found some literature on it, and it was showing how heat stress affected lactation in the female. And essentially, when they overheat, the production of milk declines in response to that, even if they still have adequate nutrition. So do you think that could occur or does occur? Do we know that if it does with whitetails?
I remember there being some research done on deer years ago. It wasn't done anywhere at the level of sophistication that can be done with livestock. And it's interesting you said that, because about a month ago, I saw another livestock dairy type paper, and they were going into that very example. And, for a cattle producer manager, what are the signs of heat stress for your milk cows, et cetera. So that is a very, very real phenomenon. And we would think, of course, that it's going to impact deer to some extent as well. Of course, it's a wild animal.
Sure.
They've kind of evolved in that situation, so they can probably handle it a little bit better. But they
can if they have the option, right?
Yeah, that's
if
right.
You go put them out on the beach, they're probably not going to handle that well.
And it's, I'm deviating a little bit, but in a bigger ecological context, that's one of the reasons we see variation in the size of deer from south to north and north to south is heat conservation up north and heat dissipation in the south. So that's part of the evolutionary part of this. Is it could be advantageous to have a smaller body size to dissipate the heat and handle that a little bit better. And that's one of even the signals, a different type of data set, Marcus. But, we see that when we look at harvest data year after year, is that we would go into some of these fall and winters and get feedback that, man, body weights are a little bit lower this year than we'd expected. And you start, of course, all this is historical. All you can do is go back and kind of line stuff up and see what's correlated best. And I know me and others, including Steve, were like, well, the answer is obvious. It's rainfall. It's got to be related to drought. It's got to be rainfall and drought index, all this kind of stuff. And what was always the stronger signal than rainfall was just heat. And it's hard to disentangle those, because usually when it's really, really hot, you don't have as much rainfall, et cetera. But that was always had a much stronger signal, was just average heat for summer and late summer. So it has an effect on them, no doubt.
Yeah. All the more reason that we might want to try to make sure that we have a diverse, thermal landscape for them to choose where they need to be, whether it's too cold or too hot.
And even food availability for them. Some might say, well, they're not going to eat as much, and typically they're not going to move as much because it's hot. But I would still like to give the deer an option of walking 50 yards and eating a forb versus having to walk 500 yards to find a forb,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you distracted me from what I was going to follow up on.
I started running rabbits, man. Sorry.
Got me all into the water situations. Oh, okay. I remember now. Folks are used to listening to me ramble around and trying to figure out what I was trying to say, or, if they can understand what I'm saying anyway. That was really interesting to think about relative to my next question. So when we're providing nutrition, obviously that's really important that mother can meet the nutritional demands for the fawn right then. But you've done a lot of work on some of these other parts of that story that I don't know if folks listening to this may not have heard you talk about, or I honestly don't fully understand it myself, so I'm assuming that there may be some confusion still around this idea of epigenetics and how, the nutrition over potentially generations is affecting things. So do you mind filling us in on,
Sure,
what we need to know about that? And I promise, folks, we're going to get to how this relates to fire, but I think it's important to think through these things before we start thinking about how to apply fire.
Well, I can pretty much guarantee you I will not get over your head or a listener's head on this, because the biochemistry is way beyond me, and I don't understand it functionally what's going on either. but I kind of understand the cause and effect type deal. And essentially, I like to think about the reason. Mother Nature / evolution, whatever way you want to say it, provides a lot of flexibility for individuals or for a species to adapt both short-term and long-term to their environment. So a way I've expressed it in the past has been, you and me and every other living organism, we have a blueprint in our body, in our cells, and it's called our DNA, our genome. And what we're learning is that blueprint can be a lot more expansive than what you might be demonstrating with the way you look right now. And some of the ways I've said it is, I got a job and I'm finally making a little bit of money and I'm going to build a house. Me and my wife, significant, we're going to build a house. And we think about it and say, hey, let's go ahead and dream big that our salaries are going to increase over time. We can only afford a little bit right now. So we get this blueprint made for a really big house. But right now, when it's time to break ground and build, we may be only able to afford to build half of it. We still have that blueprint in our hand for the grandiose house. And later in life, we might be able to add on to it and finish it. Really simple way of saying, my simple brain kind of relates to this epigenetics process is there's a lot more flexibility to express your genes given the environment and the environment of your mother. And there's even evidence to say the grandmother. So essentially, it's a feedback mechanism that goes on to, in this case, the fawn in utero. We think kind of from conception until maybe just before parturition, who knows? But basically, it's stress. If the female is experiencing some type of stress, in this case, nutritional stress, it's like little signals that are being sent to that developing fetus and the genes, et cetera, saying, it's a really tough environment. You really don't want to grow to, say, 200 pounds in this environment because you're not going to be able to support yourself. It's going to be a lot better to be about 130 pounds in this environment.
So maybe I'm thinking about wrong, but I've kind of have thought about this, and it reminded me that it's sort of like a switch. Like your blueprint, they have the option to get big. That's within the blueprint, but they're kind of switching. If things were hunky dory, they might switch that on and be really big. But if things aren't so good, it's probably not a good idea to be that big. When things are bad, switch it off. And then they don't grow that big, or don't grow as big as antlers or whatever trait you want to pick.
Getting back to my really simple example, let's jump in and let's go ahead and build the whole house that we have the blueprint for. And 2 years later, we don't have enough money, and we no longer have a house. Kind of the house of the body of the deer is very similar. I mean, Mother Nature is just so cool, and it's just fascinating, and we'll never fully understand it. But there's just all this flexibility for an organism to adapt over space and time. Their job, their currency is passing on their genes, having offspring and grand offspring, et cetera, et cetera. And so they figure out ways to maximize that. And one way of doing it is optimizing your body size to match your environment. And then, Marcus, if the environment changes, you still have built in a mechanism to grow to the new environment you're put in. And so what we think is going on, very consistent, is that when you start doing the practices that you talk about every day with habitat management and improving the amount of food that's available, over time, generation after generation, the deer are responding to it. They can grow bigger. They can grow bigger antlers, et cetera.
So that's a pretty interesting thing. You could, there's a couple ways to look at it. One, that's the reason that it's important for you to have a long-term plan. You're not just going to go out and do things once and solve everything. Like, it's a plan that unfolds over time. And so if you, let's say you bought a new property, for instance, and the land management on that property and surrounding areas has been poor, well, your initial population of deer, even if you really improve things in a short amount of time, it may still take a couple of generations of deer to respond to it because they're limited by what their grandma did, sounds like.
Absolutely.
So, but by the time, if you start that, by the time you're raising the offspring of grandma, they could actually then respond to that and even be, you might see a big jump in body size or whatever characteristics you're interested in. But is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And what is amazing, and I in no way, shape, or form, I'm not, we didn't figure this out. This was done a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually, the paper was in the Wildlife Society Bulletin, and it was called Pre-World War II Antler Research. And it was written by the late, great, and past here about a year ago, Valerius Geist. And he uncovered this research in Europe, and the researcher's name was Franz Vogt, if I remember correctly. And he did this with red deer and roe deer. And it wasn't just one time you saw this. He did this for 5 successive generations.
Mm-hmm.
They kept getting bigger and bigger, and antlers were getting larger and larger. And it was just amazing that there was this much capacity built within the genome of this little roe deer, this little red deer at the time, of what they could grow into if they had the food to support the big body, and we were just able to demonstrate how this works in a Mississippi context. And there was a similar paper right before us from South Dakota State University, showed the same thing with whitetails there. So I think there's enough examples of this occurring to where we feel really solid about it. And let me well, I'm not bragging. It was just a special moment. I got to meet Valerius Geist. It was about 4 years ago at a meeting, and it just brought me such joy to go up and have a conversation with him. And I got to tell him about our experiment and relating it back to his paper that he wrote. And he got so excited about it and got into it and talked about it. So that was a highlight.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things to tie that up. Don't necessarily expect things to all happen immediately, and don't necessarily think that whatever you're observing right now is all that can be done.
Yeah.
And change may happen incrementally and over generations because of just these different genetics, but they probably have them in their blueprint if you start providing really high quality habitat for meeting all these different demands. And it's probably safe to say that it's not even completely driven by nutrition even, right? It could be other things in the environment, like you were saying, the conservation of heat. Yeah. For instance, like a lot of these things are, I guess, interrelated. Like if you had really high quality fawning cover, it may often provide really high quality nutrition. So you can't necessarily detangle them in that circumstance. But, there could be other factors that are going on with good high quality habitat that aren't strictly from nutrition, even that could influence populations like this.
Yeah. And I think the literature shows this really important, and I think this has been demonstrated most with mice and things like that, is when you and I, most often when we talk about stress, we're talking about nutritional stress. And that was kind of the example I was given. But there's also bona fide stress, like humans, we feel stress. That has a big epigenetic indicator as well for things like that. And having quality fawning cover could be a part of that story as well. Thermoregulatory issues, that could be a part of the story as well. But yeah, basically you want mom to be in good condition in every way possible.
Yeah, you want mama to be happy and grandmama to be happy.
Yeah, and Marcus, let's I guess along those lines, let's think about it too, is the process we're describing kind of for every individual is going to set a trajectory. And that doesn't mean that once, you've quote, flipped the switches for these epigenetics, that all is good. All you've basically told, the mother has told the genetic expression, now you have the capacity to grow this big. So it still takes management all along the way to keep fulfilling, that capacity. And that's not to say either that on an annual basis, you still won't see gains, for example, in body weight and antler size. You will. It's just based on that trajectory that was assigned to that deer at birth. We can go above it or below it a little bit based on annual availability of nutritional resources.
Yeah. Interesting.
As always, Marcus, like you said a minute ago, it's short-term game, annually, long-term, decades.
Yeah.
What do you want to do?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, a lot of the things, I guess, from a habitat standpoint, a lot of the things that make the generations all happy also benefit a whole suite of other species, because we're talking about vegetation characteristics. It sounds like that this developed understory with a healthy distribution of forbs within it and makeup. That's the kind of stuff we're targeting. Right.
Right.
Folks that have been listening to this, and a lot of the folks out there that are listening, I know have tons of experience of their own, some of which that I've talked to have more burning experience than I do by far. So they know fire can help promote a lot of these plants and vegetation conditions. So rather than us belaboring those points, I wanted, I kind of started it out with a couple of things I get asked about. So I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit about something I get asked about that even the people that have a lot of experience may not know, or may not, know what to say when they get asked about it. So one thing I get asked about, particularly when I'm talking about when to burn, and you've heard a lot of the stuff. I've talked a lot about extending the burn window and different benefits of different times. And I know you've worked on a lot of stuff related to this as well, some of it with me. One of the questions I get really commonly is, well, if I extend the burn window to during fawning, am I going to burn the fawns up? So go.
It is absolutely possible you could kill an individual. If you, and think of this also in proportions. If my property is 1,000 acres or 500 or whatever, and I burn the whole thing during the peak of fawning, I'm probably going to kill some fawns. Do I know how many, what proportion? I have no idea. It's reasonable to assume you're going to kill some individuals. But if it's a portion of your property during peak fawning, it's not going to be any big deal. And the good is going to outweigh the bad, because an individual fawn may have died, but look at the nutrition you have added now for the population. And you maybe even increase the survival likelihood of the fawns that didn't die via fire. Now they're better conditioned to make it through fall and winter. So it's a net gain.
Yeah. So, but you may get that same net gain if you move it to another time, or there's a net gain even over other times.
Well, I am a disciple of Marcus Lashley.
Oh, yeah.
And I have heard you talk many times and you had a great analysis on quantifying in the real world, how many days do you have available to burn?
Yeah.
So I put more weight on getting the job done and getting whatever stand burned over the risk of a few fawns, possibly, can't even say they will, possibly dying. You have experience where fire went through a stand where you knew fawns were because you had a collar on it.
Well,
And
I was going to follow up with that. I don't have nearly the experience with deer research that you do, but I have a fair amount with fawning relative to fire. And I think you keyed in on one thing that's really important, and that's scale. You know, if you're burning at smaller scales, there's very little risk, and I agree with you fully on that. But another thing that I would add to that, and then I was going to follow that sort of with a question, during our fawning studies, where a lot of the burning on the landscape, and even at some big scales in many cases in North Carolina, it was occurring all during the middle and during the peak, from the beginning to the end of fawning. There was fire going on all the time. And some of the times the fawns that we had radiotaped, like you said, were literally in burn units. And we did not have a single fawn succumb to fire over, many fawns tracked with a lot of fire on the ground during fawning. And we even had cases where we had fawns that were born, within a couple of days of the fire that occurred, and they still hung out in little patches of vegetation and that. So all that to say, from my experience, they weren't getting burned up. Could one get burned up? Sure. But even in that case, which is a pretty extreme example from scale and timing wise, and those things interacting, that wasn't happening, at least with the ones we monitored. But I was curious, from your experience with the literature, has there been one documented?
Well, I was just about to kind of jokingly, but again, to make a point, say, you did a fawn survival / mortality study, and my goodness, there's been 50. Is that safe to say?
Oh my gosh.
How many? Good Lord, a
basically
bunch.
Every state.
And there's all the big ones. What was it? Predation, and then you divide it up. What kind of predator? And then was it stillborn or malnutrition or blah 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 disease? It goes on and on. There's never a box that you check for, did it die by prescribed fire?
That's not a box in there.
That's not a big mortality event that anyone ever considers.
Well,
it's trivial.
You made me think of another thing, which is related to the conversation you had earlier when you were talking about the fawns across the gradient and how different it is up in the northern part of the range versus the south. And we had that big meta-analysis that you led with Eric Mitchell, and it was over 1,000 fawns, I believe, in that meta-analysis, basically a study of studies, an analysis of all these different studies.
Yep.
Across a whole lot of flammable landscape. I know a few of those sites getting set on fire all the time, and a lot of 3 of the sites in particular, a lot during fawning for sure. And there wasn't one in that data set either.
Yeah, exactly. So, there are studies where fawns were monitored when the landscape was being burned and didn't document it. And again, we don't want a gotcha moment with somebody. We're not saying that it can't happen. We're just saying that
if you have
it's not a management concern,
you need to send it to Bronson. Your email is going to get blown up. No, I'm with you. Sure, they are vulnerable to it, and it could happen. And if you have the opportunity to adjust the timing a little bit to make sure that never happens, then that may be fine. But another thing that was really interesting, and I know we have a paper together with Rainer Nichols that we showed some similar things, but the timing of fire it's pretty important for the nutrient pulse that you get from fire. And particularly from Rayner's study and the study in North Carolina that I did during my postdoc, the thing that was telling is if you're burning in February, March, April, those months when fawns are being born in June and lactation, July, that time frame, the pulse that you would get from the fire with those early fires, it's already lost.
Yeah.
You still have a lot of good vegetation and a lot of green stuff that's in reach, and a lot of plants might colonize the forbs that are really good. But in terms of the resprouting vegetation that's responding and the high quality pulse and the expansion of the available nutrition to plants they may not typically eat, that is ephemeral.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but the study that we just got published after Rayner's, from that study up there, we did something else that I found very interesting, and I thought you might. We actually looked at where the fawn was born in that population, because it was a population that has no subsidization at all. They don't have any food plots or anything else. They're living off of the land and fire, and it's a super poor site. Really, I think it's actually the poorest soil in the range of whitetail deer. It ranks 0 on productivity. So pretty poor site. They're living off of fire, and the timing, the importance of that timing is magnified in that landscape because of that. And when we looked at fawns, we had a high proportion of fawns starve. Mother just couldn't feed them for whatever reason. And when we looked at where those fawns were born relative to fawns that did not starve, so the mother could feed them, in relation to burning during fawning, they were much more likely to starve when they did not have close access to something that had been burned during, like right at the birth time.
Yeah.
Because the peak lactation, several weeks later, 3, 6, 8 weeks later, is when that peak lactation demand is occurring. So that's when the pulse would happen after the fire, is what I'm getting at.
Right.
You'd have a relatively high biomass of really high quality stuff.
Yeah. So that's, I think the word optimize is appropriate here, to where, like you're saying, in the dormant season, of course, it's still beneficial.
Yeah.
Like you're
A lot of
saying,
great stuff.
you're going into summer and you still have vegetative structure.
Mhm.
So in terms of a place to hide or lay down, yep, you've got it.
Mhm.
But then if you're also pairing that with when you're burning later, so like you say, you're then coupling or matching when those nutrients resources are available when they need it most.
Mhm.
And in a lot of places, it may just be, yeah, they still live. You just didn't do as best as you can. Or you can get in a place like where you were at, your study site was, that could literally mean life or death.
Mhm.
They're teetering on such low available nutrition.
I think another thing that you just said that's really important is they need to cover in the nutrition, and they may not necessarily be together.
Yeah.
So having them close together, so you may have a patch that you burned during, that you burned last year, and a patch that you burned in the dormant season, and then adjacent to that you have a patch that's going to be a really high quality forage patch because you burn it in June or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you have those things where she has the choice of where to put her fawn so that it's safe, and then close access to some really high quality nutrition. And as we've talked about quite a bit, some of the highest quality plants, other, forbs are of course really high quality generally all the time, some of them, but in terms of the woody resprouting tissue, when it's really high quality is when it's been top killed by fire and is resprouting to that. So really interesting. So it sounds like we're in general alignment with, some fire on the ground during that time. It's probably a big net gain.
Absolutely.
Probably don't want to light the whole world on fire at that time, but
Yeah.
Having a little bit is probably beneficial, even if you happen to cross the rare mortality as a result.
And I think if you're going to stick with optimizing, the adjacency is always a consideration as well. Just an absurd example here is you could have, we burned this later in the year and it's providing great nutrition, but maybe not as much cover. We burned during the dormant season over here, it's providing great cover. Well, we don't want those a mile apart.
Right.
We want those
She needs to be able
adjacent to
to-
each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we talk about that with it's all the species that we're managing for. It's really important that they can access all of their habitat components for all their life stages at the same time at the right time.
Right.
And this always comes up as really important, and certainly important for deer during that critical time period. So
Marcus, it just always, no, I've said this earlier, it just resonates with me so intensely that when you're disturbing the landscape, and you have by fire preferably, but other techniques as well, all this stuff for the most part takes care of itself. You're addressing cover for predation, you're addressing nutrition. I mean, all of that takes care of itself if you just implement these tools with regularity.
Well, I think that's an important thing with a practice like fire. You're monitoring. Obviously, you could end up in a situation, maybe you've got some invasive plants or something that you have to deal with. But if you're managing well with that practice, because it's all encapsulating and promoting the kinds of plant communities, composition and structurally, that are providing a lot of these key things, it kind of takes care of all of the issues at once, as opposed to some of the other practices that we might do that with surgical precision address one, sometimes well and sometimes not so well, but it's addressing one thing, wherever something like prescribed fire could address many of the checks in the check boxes at the same time.
I'll tell you another one. This is not fire, it's indirectly related to fire.
It
I
always
just
is.
think with you, yes. One technique that I think often gets neglected when you think about all of the positive impacts of thinning your forest and prescribed fire and then food plots, et cetera. And a lot of people lose sight of deer density. And so, I mean, a couple years, so you start doing what the techniques that you recommend, but you can really negate the positive benefit of that if you have too many deer on the landscape. So that's always for everybody. That's still a very, very strong component of management, is making sure the number of deer is in line with what's available.
In your experience, what do you think people neglect most often? And let's just say it's the typical landowner has 1,000 acres in the South that's interested in deer. What are they neglecting on it?
Well, I would say if they have the ability, so we have to give our lease hunters a pass here, because often we had an episode
well,
of that.
I said a private landowner, not an industrial private landowner that's leasing it.
I would just say in general, habitat management. I just don't think there's a lot of people that are actively engaged with habitat management, or it may be something that's really, really good. Like, okay, they are going to thin their forest, but that's like that every, 5, 6, 10-year event they do, but they're still not then adding in the other stuff that they could also do. And what I often see too is the larger and larger the property. So some of these really premier places that might be 5,000 acres or larger, typically the habitat isn't managed as well there either, because there's just so much to do. But that's where deer density really comes into play as well.
Yeah, they just can't kill enough of them on that large of an acreage.
It gets overwhelming.
It
gets overwhelming, and they get tired of it. Yeah.
Well, when you get 5,000 acre property and you need to 150 does or something to just keep it in check. That get kind of old.
Yeah, you got about the 5-year window. You'll do that, and you'll finally get the density kind of under control, and maybe the habitat's responding a little bit, and you start seeing some changes, and fawn recruitment goes up. Good and bad right there. But body weight goes up, fat conditioning, all that, and fawn recruitment goes up. And now we gotta keep killing that many, or now we got to kill more. It's just, it can be tough.
Yeah. Well, I've certainly seen that situation, and I agree with you at the broad stroke that we just painted there, that definitely seems to be missing more often than other practices that people engage with. There also, more recently, I've run into situations and get asked some questions about sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, where they're actually doing some pretty intensive habitat stuff, and they just, for whatever reason, have a really low deer density, and they're kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum. And then they're questioning, should I be shooting any does, or how should I structure my harvest management and that sort of thing. So
yeah, I have seen some places, and there are definitely some cases like that, and I don't think we can sit here and generalize and say
right.
we did all this stuff and we're not because there's probably a different answer in every one of those. But that's pretty rare. It's pretty rare for that to happen. And, it could be, just one example, you may have had a really severe EHD outbreak, and it just really dinged the population. And even though you are engaged in habitat management and you made it a lot better, you kind of still may be in a place to where it's just going to take a little bit longer for the deer population to respond.
Yeah.
Another big one that, get on my high horse here about pigs. We still don't fully understand the negative interactions on some of these places, and pigs and competition they might be having as well.
Yeah. Well, hopefully a lot of these research efforts that are going on to understand that, we'll start getting some better insight into that.
That's right. I hope so.
So, well, I don't want to keep you around all day. So, are there any take-home messages or anything that we didn't talk about that you think we should mention?
One little is, if you want to kind of probably get a better description of that whole epigenetics process we talked about earlier, if your listener wanted to look back at some of the Deer University podcast episodes.
You're trying to get my listeners to actually, they're probably already listening to your stuff anyways.
I can't remember. It was with Eric Mitchell, and I think we may have had Eric Mitchell and epigenetics, but certainly I think epigenetics in the title. But go back and take a look at that. We had a good discussion about it.
Yeah, that's probably a year ago now, wasn't it? It's been a while.
Good Lord, Marcus.
What?
It's a heck of a lot longer than that, man.
What oh, maybe he was on for a different. Maybe I'm just old.
Yeah, there you go. You hit the nail on the head.
I'm just
old. I'm even older.
Well, you can see all the gray in my beard.
Yeah,
probably.
You just can't see mine.
Yeah, it's probably grayed quite a bit since you saw me last time. I'm aging rapidly.
I wasn't going to say anything.
Aging rapidly. Yeah. So you're saying it's been longer than a year. So you want people to go into the archives.
I'm going to say we're pushing 3 years.
Wow.
When Eric was on. Yeah.
The last time he was on, or just about epigenetics?
That episode with epigenetics. It was one of the, probably within the first 10 or so episodes. Yeah.
I didn't think it was that far back. I'm wrong, I'm sure.
I hope you're right, but I think you're wrong.
Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, that'd be a good resource. I know that you guys have gone in, and it was probably more fresh on your brain at the time as well. Yeah. So that'd be a good discussion for folks to look into. I know that I didn't know anything about it until y'all started talking about it. So it's great information, definitely important from a management standpoint, and probably applies to other species, as well. So
absolutely.
Really good stuff. Well, one thing I did want to mention before we go, if you all out there are following us on social media or anything, you may have seen that we posted a link to a survey, and we really would appreciate it if you haven't already, take a minute, go on UF Deer Lab or at Dr. Disturbance on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, and fill out that survey. It takes less than a minute, but Bronson and I both really appreciate that kind of feedback. So if you've been listening to NRU or any of our podcasts, it allows us basically to quantify how, what people enjoy about the podcast, how much impact it's having, so that we can give it to our administrators and essentially prove to them that this is a worthwhile endeavor. So if you could be so kind to give us a minute of your time and provide us that feedback, I'd really appreciate it, since I'm having to put that in here not too long from now. So
we always, Marcus, that's part of what we do as academics. We have to justify our existence, so to speak. And so once a year, twice a year, you got to sit down and they administrators are, what have you done?
Yeah.
And an administrator a few years ago, I would say, well, we started a podcast, and they would go, what's a podcast?
Well, I think that's one of the things about it is, we're trying, this is about sharing information, and, we're trying to help share information to improve the resource best we can. And part of that is, our listeners have been sharing the information with their friends. They, you talked about recently going on and rating the podcast. That helps with the algorithm to make sure that it's more visible to people that are looking for it. And all of those things are helping us, especially if you go and do the survey and those sorts of things. All of it's helping us show our administration, who in many cases are exactly like what you just said, that, I'm saying, well, I'm doing this podcasting, and, this is how many people are listening, and here's the social media. And then they're like, well, so what?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily inherently valuable just at face value to folks that are not used to that kind of programming. We're trying to be innovative and get this out to more people. So we really appreciate all the feedback that we've gotten already. And, if you can take a minute, we'd really appreciate it.
Hey, along those lines, in terms of, podcasts and all the innovations we have, we're also really trying to grow our YouTube channel, Marcus, and I know you are too, with the UF Deer Lab. So a lot of this content is on YouTube, so please go subscribe to that as well.
Yeah. We share a lot of the resources that we've talked about, so you can see visualizations or videos or whatever. A lot of great stuff on there. All right. Well,
all right.
Thanks, Bronson. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us and educate us on all this good stuff you've been working on. So we really appreciate it.
Always happy to help.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next time.
Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.